And what's your pleasure?
From the Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine, I'm Elizabeth McLeod with Auction Waves.
32,500, 100,000 there. Players all over the house. 400,000 of this rare piece, and 600,000, 900,000, 1 million, 1,175 once, 100,175 twice. We all good? Sold.
Music is the soundtrack of our lives. And in these days of earbuds and streaming on demand, the tunes that get us through the day are a lot less public than they used to be. But if you're of a certain age, you remember the time when a trip out to eat, a trip to the bowling alley, a trip to just about any place that was fun to visit, offered musical accompaniment from a jukebox. We're featuring a vintage 1940s jukebox in our next feature auction. And today we'll spend some time with a man who can tell us all about these fascinating artifacts of the not-so-distant past and the colorful stories they have to tell. But first, our latest auction news. The days are getting longer, but time is growing ever shorter before our 2026 Winter Enchantment Auction, with 3 exciting days of art, antiques, and decor to suit every collecting taste. Every feature auction we conduct at the galleries offers a fine selection of marine items, and Enchantment 2026 is no exception. This year we're featuring an impressive collection of scrimshaw from the Ronald T. Varillo collection, and auctioneer Kaja Veyu tells us all about it.
There's 37 pieces in this private collection, which was just assigned to us to be sold from the family. My dad collected all the scrimshaw throughout his life. The subject matter ranges from sailors and whaling boats and clipper ships and pelicans and dragons, portraits, and it has everything.
Marine art is also in the spotlight with an impressive assortment of maritime paintings from the 19th century through to the 21st. We'll also have fine timepieces and instruments designed for rugged shipboard use, and a whole lot more with a nautical theme. If you love the sea, you'll find something of interest in our 2026 Winter Enchantment Auction, February 20th, 21st, and 22nd. View these unique items for yourself at our preview sessions beginning Saturday, February 14th, or make arrangements for a virtual viewing with one of our staff specialists at thomastonauction.com. This is Auction Waves, and I'm Elizabeth McLeod. If you have one of any item, you have that item. If you have 2, you have a pair. But if you have 19, well, then neighbor, you're a collector. And that's Ed Liss, advocate and preservationist of the Great American Jukebox. When a classic model 1422 Rock-Ola Jukebox appeared in our Winter Enchantment Auction as lot number 3014, I knew I wanted to bring an expert on these fascinating machines onto our program. And when I heard about Ed's collection, I knew he was the man. Ed Liss, welcome to Auction Waves. Now, I've been around antique radios for a long time, and I personally collect 78 RPM records. And I've met quite a few people in these circles who own one jukebox. But never have I met anyone who has 19 jukeboxes. So before we get into the meat of the discussion here, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you became a world-class jukebox collector.
It's a challenge. I mean, you got to have grit to do this. I was born and raised in New York City, and I lived in an apartment house, and in the bottom of the street was a luncheonette, Rosie's Cafe, that had a bubbling Wurlitzer in it. And when I was 3 years old, I would stand on a chair and watch the mechanism work. I was fascinated by it. My father used to travel to California, and I went with him several times. I must have put nickels in every jukebox back and forth. But I've been collecting jukeboxes since 1975. They were called, in the industry, they were called nickel grabbers because they cost a nickel and it would grab your money, you don't play.
You mentioned that you were really interested in watching the mechanism, and that's something that's always kind of fascinated me about jukeboxes. What happens when you put the nickel in? Can you trace that for us?
Jukeboxes are very precisely engineered. What happens when you put a nickel in, it sets off a series of micro switches That triggers the motor. That triggers the selection so you can make the proper selection. Rock-Ola jukeboxes were designed by a guy named Smythe. They were very, very well made, the Rock-Ola machines. Rock-Ola was a brilliant businessman, and he started making scales, weight scales, in the early 30s.
And this is
And in
David
19
Rock-Ola, just to clarify.
David Rock-Ola,
Right.
David C. Cullen Rock-Ola. And in 1935, he made his first jukebox, a 12 selection wooden Art Deco machine, and it was on the maiden voyage of the Queen Mary that sailed from New York to Southampton.
Now you think about jukeboxes as being a 50s thing, but as we've seen, they really started to take off in the 1930s. There had been jukeboxes well before this. Things weren't called that, but Edison had fooled around with rubber earphone playback things in the 19th century. Why do you think the jukebox took off in the middle of the 20th century when it did?
Because sound was amplified in 1927. So now you had a machine that could reach out and, entertain a whole room. You didn't need an orchestra or a band. A nickel gave you access to music. And now the music was amplified. And then in 1933, when Prohibition was repealed, that's when jukeboxes really took off because you could drink, you could socialize. And again, the jukeboxes evolved. They started out as really radio cabinets, like in the early 30s, and then they migrated into translucent plastics. So by the late 1930s, the quality of fidelity was improved significantly. Jukeboxes in the early 30s could not go beyond 5,000 hertz or cycles on the sound spectrum. But unlike digital, which is zeros and ones, everything you heard on an analog jukebox, 100% was played back.
Now, the ones I've heard have a very, very powerful bass response. Were they specifically engineered for that?
It wasn't like the boomy bass you hear today. It was a more mellow, buttery type bass. Nothing could outperform a jukebox except maybe a live band. I had the New Orleans Preservation Hall Jazz Band in my home in the late 90s, all of them. And they went nuts when they heard the jukeboxes. They said they had a fat sound. Giving you compliments like that, it really makes my heart swirl because I love that.
They do really bring out everything that was recorded in those records.
The jukeboxes were way ahead of the mainstream. Rock-Ola was a genius. They used noise cancellation circuitry in 1937. And noise cancellation circuitry, basically, if you know 78s, they had hissing and it took out all the noise, all of it. They removed the noise completely, so every record, no matter how old it was, sounded crystal clear. It was an amazing feat.
I know that in the late 30s, with the rise of the swing era, it was a much more youthfully oriented popular music than perhaps had been the case 10 years earlier. And the jukebox to me almost seems to reflect that. It has this youthful exuberance that it just epitomizes that period for me. Was that a conscious trend, or did it just sort of develop?
Jukeboxes are precisely tuned to the age. Again, you look at the styles in the early 30s compared to the late 30s, the records, the music, the way it looks, the way it plays, and certainly the way it makes you feel when you hear it are all part of that whole experience. It's called the Jukebox Experience. It became a staple in American culture. The machine you showed me, the 1422 model, came out in 1946, about after World War II. The one I have is the year after, in 1947, 1426, which was very elaborately adorned with plating and beautiful colors. They all used the same mechanism. They were called the Magic Glo series. The only thing different was the cabinet. One other thing Rock-Ola did, if you look on your machine, the 1422, there's a little window on the right side. It says, thank you. When you put the money in, the light comes on, it says, thank you. Rock-Ola was always interested in thanking his customers for using his product. That's why he did that.
What else did Rock-Ola make? Were they strictly a jukebox company at this point?
No, they made skee ball machines, the old skee ball machines. Rock-Ola made skee ball. They made games of chance, which were gambling devices, basically paying out gumballs or cigars, but it wasn't like they paid out money. It was just
Trade
product.
stimulators.
Yeah. They also made a lot of machines that you find in arcades, baseball machines, pinball machines. They made a lot of those types of products, and they were very well done.
Now, I understand that the coin-operated entertainment industry during the 30s and 40s especially was not awfully popular in certain parts of the country. I know that Mayor LaGuardia crusaded against pinball machines, and he wasn't especially fond of jukeboxes either. And all of this was because of, well, the link to organized crime. Is that something that affected the popularity of jukeboxes, do you think?
Organized crime got involved because jukeboxes and pinballs and cigarette machines, it's all cash business. There was an article printed in November of 1955 by Reader's Digest, which exposed the rackets in the jukeboxes. It was a brilliant article. It was written by a guy named Lester Veely, and I worked for Reader's Digest in the early 80s, and I was a senior executive there, so I had access to his personal information, and I called him up. He had been long retired. And I asked him, I said, when you wrote that article about the rackets in the jukeboxes, what happened? He said, they threatened us. Well, Reader's Digest was not to be intimidated because it was a big company and they were very active in Washington, so they didn't care. And basically, the mob. But then what happened is in 1957, jukebox manufacturers had enough of the mob and they solicited the government in Appalachia, New York. They had a meeting of the mob, and the feds raided them and arrested a lot of them, and a lot of them went to jail. So that kind of subsided for a while. Well, jukeboxes also, I mean, they didn't have a bad reputation, but when you thought of jukeboxes, you'd think of, low life. It wasn't a great cultural experience until the 50s when teenagers came into vogue and changed that whole scenario
So
completely.
the rock and roll era really kind of resuscitated the jukebox after all of this. Whatever became of jukeboxes? I remember going into luncheonettes and diners and cafes and things like that when I was little, and there was always a jukebox, but you just don't see them anymore. Where'd they go?
CD jukeboxes came out in the mid 80s. And then, of course, they had live streaming. So the jukebox itself wasn't necessary. But I got to tell you, and I tell this to a lot of young people, human beings are analog people. We are not binary. We don't talk in zeros and ones. Analog music will always surpass digital. Why? Because digital music has no overtones. And overtones are what make the connection between humans and music. But if you heard an analog record and a digital record, the same record, you'd hear a complete difference in the quality of what you're hearing.
I
Okay.
fully agree with you on that. I play most of the music that I listen to at home off 78s. I think
Well,
if you listen to the King Porter stomp on a jukebox, I think it would be
yes.
a life-changing experience. Ed Liss, thank you so much for joining us today. And well, may all your machines run well, and may you never run out of nickels.
A little traveling music from 1925 there by Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. Newly arrived, I might say, in the public domain. We aren't playing that on a jukebox, but, well, consider it a bit of inspiration. Thanks again to Ed Liss for joining us on today's program, and if you'd like to learn more about Ed and his collection, filmmaker Andrew Stein has filmed a series of fascinating documentary clips showing some of Ed's machines in action. You can see those at drewvideo.com. And don't forget, you can see our 1946 Rock-Ola Jukebox and all the rest of the items in our 2026 Winter Enchantment auction in our catalog, available online now at thomastonauction.com. And in-person previews at the galleries begin on Saturday, February 14th. If you're in the area, come on by and see us. And if you're far away, consider a virtual visit. You'll learn how on our website. And don't forget to register to bid in this exciting 3-day auction, February 20th, 21st, and 22nd. Today's program was written and edited for you by yours truly, Elizabeth McLeod, wishing you smooth sailing and happy bidding for Auction Waves. Auction Waves is an exclusive presentation of Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine.